Welcome back. This is the second part of my talk, 2023, the year the university system died. There are a few things to add, large scale and small. First of all, on the large scale. The problem that we face is that the collapse of the university system, through its internal problems, is going to have probably a follow-on effect on civilization as a whole. If the university system fails, as it is failing on a colossal scale, then civilization can't succeed either. It will fail as well. It will begin to collapse. I think this happens in two stages. When you don't have an educated population that are capable of reasoning and of understanding others' point of view, if they do not understand history as it occurred, if they do not understand theoretical matters of how the world works, if these things are lacking, then what you first get in the process is a collapse of civility. Now, we've been seeing this for a long time, and it becomes evident in a number of ways, but civility is an important bond of cohesion in societies. Civility is what makes things run and run smoothly without absurd aggravation and absurd aggression and the rest, without the idea that you can consider your fellow citizens as objects of predation as opposed to those who are capable of being friends and neighbors, etc., etc. Once there is a breakdown of civility, and I think we've seen it most dramatically in the past 5 years, then what we see is that civilization can't survive from this. The knock-on effect of these things is devastating. For once you get the collapse of civility, then all of the building that is required and the rebuilding that is required in civilization to create things that are of worth to all of your fellow citizens, to give them the sense of community and belonging, how this will allow people to cohere into a group in which they feel safe, then civilization falls apart. It becomes one against all and all against one. And that is probably, unfortunately, what we're seeing. Civilization can't survive the failure of the university system. The university system, on the second part, there needs to be an amount of training. In the 19th century, one can say that most of civilization was built by a handful of people who knew what they were doing and were able to contribute. If there had been many more of them, they could undoubtedly have done better, but they managed to build what they needed to build. When you have a collapse of civilization as a whole, and in particular in the university system, then you eventually will not have those people. You will have people who have qualifications, but who are not qualified. And you need brilliant, qualified people in medicine and chemistry and engineering, physics. All of these areas require not just people with degrees, but people who have brilliance in those degrees and can contribute. And in a sense, it's obvious that that's what you need. A run-of-the-mill doctor is not a good doctor. You need a good doctor, very, very good doctors. And if you don't have that, then health fails. And if health fails, mental health fails. And if enough mental health fails, and it's obvious that that is what's happening, then again, civilization collapses. You cannot have a population that is mostly sick, including mentally sick, being helped by people who are not properly equipped to deal with those ailments. All that will happen in that circumstance is things will get worse and worse and worse. Now, and in a sense, these things become obvious when you deal with things that have very practical implications. Pilots, aviation. If we do not have enough well-trained, competent pilots, planes will crash. And when you start seeing planes crash from incompetence, then you will have the writing very clearly written in front of you that we are at a point of probably no return. I believe that we're probably at a point of no return now, because I don't think the university system can be brought back. I think once it's collapsed to the point that it has, we are in serious trouble. Now, the point of the last talk, the first part of my talk, was that the university system has, in a sense, rotted from within, and that rot has spread out, principally from the certain departments of arts in the arts faculties around the world. And it may seem as though I'm pointing the finger very heavily against the United States, and it's certainly true that these things are most advanced there. But you are finding these problems in Britain as well, and to some extent across Europe, and those problems are plain and writ large there. So what we get is, first of all, plagiarism becoming more and more widespread. And then in certain arts subjects, too much gibberish that people can't understand. And that means that you have generations of students who are forced into the position, into a sort of Stockholm syndrome, where they have to pretend that the gibberish that they're hearing is a very meaningful set of, well, a meaningful instruction in something that's important. And then those people get jobs and they repeat the process. And what you end up with is several generations, which we now have, because this process started easily in the 1980s, several generations where you're getting people who have no idea how to reason, no idea how to think, no idea what that means. That's a fairly advanced problem now. There's no obvious way of fixing that. People whose minds are already broken in terms of reasoning, you can't easily unbreak them in this way. And once they are instructors, lecturers, etc., professors in the university system, then what you get is one broken individual passing that brokenness on to others. And then and the horrible irony, well, it's not even an irony, it's a horrible fact that students pay for this. In a sense, what I'm suggesting is that students are now paying through the nose to have their reason broken into pieces so that they can never properly function again. Because my experience is that once you seriously break someone's ability to think, that is very, very hard to undo. In a sense, it's a little bit like the cult phenomenon. Once you join the cult, your thinking is broken, you are made to believe various things, and you can't think outside of that. You can't break the circle to get outside of it. Your reasoning is captured, and essentially destroyed through this process. The cult process is very, very similar to what is happening in universities. And yes, people can wake up, but the more entrenched this is, the less they understand that they've been part of a cult, the more they don't see that their money has been stolen from them, and what they've got in return is a broken life, then the more it will just go on. I mean, I don't say this lightly. This is the most serious thing that one can imagine. To have people pay to have their lives essentially destroyed. At any rate, I've made this point, and I suppose I shouldn't press it too much, because I'm sure that people will feel as though, no, it's not that bad. Well, it is that bad. And as I've said in the last part of this, we've been watching this grow since the 1980s, and it certainly set in very strongly even in the 1990s. Since 2000, it's a runaway train. It's not a 5-year phenomenon. It's not something that's just happened. I think journalists often think, well, this is a new thing. No, it's not. It's an old thing. Probably the only faculty or the only department that seems to be still withstanding this rot, this corrosion, is probably mathematics. Which is ironical, because the example that I want to give you, the small example of how plagiarism destroys things, actually comes from mathematical physics. It's the story of Schrödinger's cat, which everyone knows and everyone repeats. And what I want to suggest to you is that it was an example of plagiarism. Schrödinger did not invent Schrödinger's cat. He embellished it, but he didn't invent it. It was invented by Einstein. Now, I want to show you what actually happened here. Because Schrödinger had exchanges with Einstein in the 1920s. They had exchanged letters, and there was a degree of amiability to this. But suddenly it was the 22nd of April 1926, there was the first hint of trouble. And here it is. Einstein wrote to Schrödinger on April 22nd. He said, I'll read it to you. He said, "I see no basic difference between your work on the theory of the ideal gas and my own. For according to you, too, the state of equal probability is characterized by the values of the set of numbers n1, n2, n3, etc., where the numbers n1, n2, n3, etc., have the same meanings as they do for me. I do not understand how you are allowed to use the last form of Schrödinger's equation 4, which we'll forget about, of your equation 4 in your article, since this is not consistent with the condition that the sum of n4 equals a constant." So, the first hint, the first suggestion of trouble, and that was in 1926. Let's go to then 1935, 9 years later. Einstein had published in the early part of 1935 a paper which has become, more recently, very famous. It's called, in short, the EPR paper, Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen paradox, or the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen paper. And it set out a problem for the standard view in quantum mechanics. Now, there was an exchange of letters between Schrödinger and Einstein, which seemed friendly enough initially. In fact, the previous problem in 1926 had been largely resolved by Schrödinger being very friendly towards Einstein. So Einstein seemed to forget what he had been perhaps subtly complaining about in that letter, and things had worn off. And again, in 1935, there was an initially very friendly exchange where Schrödinger was coming, in a sense, to Einstein's aid by agreeing with him that there were serious problems with quantum mechanics and saying that he didn't see how the orthodox interpretation, which was led by Niels Bohr, had resolved any of those problems. He said the things which were very supportive of Einstein, excuse me, but there was a lead up to a problem, because Schrödinger was encouraged to write for himself an article explaining to himself the problems in quantum mechanics, starting from this initial paper that Einstein, Podolsky, Rosen had authored, and contributing his own suggestions. And this went back and forth repeatedly until in August the 8th of 1935, Einstein sent him a thought experiment, which was supposed to show how untenable the orthodox view that he was arguing against was, in support of what Schrödinger had also wanted to do. So what he said was this. He said, "The system is a substance in chemically unstable equilibrium. Perhaps a charge of gunpowder that by means of intrinsic forces can spontaneously combust, and where the average lifespan of the whole setup is a year. In principle, this can quite easily be represented quantum mechanically. In the beginning, the psi function, which means the psi function represents the state of the system. In the beginning, the psi function characterizes a reasonably well-defined macroscopic state. But according to your equation, after the course of a year, this is no longer the case at all. Rather, the psi function then describes a sort of, note the words, a sort of blend of not yet and of already exploded systems." I'll say that again. A sort of blend of not yet and of already exploded systems. Through no art of interpretation can this psi function be turned into an adequate description of the real state of affairs. For, in reality, there is just no intermediary between exploded and not exploded. Well, there is no cat present in that example, but all of the logical ingredients are there. And indeed, when you find this repeated in Schrödinger's cat paradox, where he puts the cat in the box with, as it were, in with the dynamite, but in Schrödinger's case, it's in with the decay of the particle, which goes with the hydrocyanic acid dropping into the box, etc., and killing the cat. When Schrödinger repeats this with that modification, and when he says, in the same words as Einstein had used, that this results in a smeared out case of cat alive and cat dead, this is the same scenario, essentially. It's got a cat added to it, but it's the same thing. And it's even in Einstein's words in the original paper. Now that paper appeared, Schrödinger's paper, appeared in Naturwissenschaften, which was a journal for explanatory articles in physics, which would have a sort of a greater reach. And Schrödinger had published 3 sections to this paper in Naturwissenschaften, and it was published in German in 1935. And for a long time, it had no impact whatsoever. It was in German, not English, and it went nowhere. There was a little bit of disgruntlement with it, but essentially not much happened. Now, it's not clear how long it took, but this and another issue seems to have caused a split between Einstein and Schrödinger. Because after Schrödinger had given his own paper, which used the Schrödinger cat without referencing Einstein at all in the Naturwissenschaften, then not long after this, Einstein broke off the correspondence. If we move forward then to 1936, Schrödinger had introduced something in the 1935 Naturwissenschaften paper that was crucially important, but was completely ignored at the time. And it was the issue now of importance all over modern physics, all over. It's probably one of the dominant things in modern physics, the issue of entanglement. Entanglement, the word entanglement, was introduced by Schrödinger in the 1935 paper. Under German was Verschränkung, and that entanglement or enmeshed nature was a sort of entanglement between particles. Now that was much more interesting and important than the issue of Schrödinger's cat, that first, which appeared on the first page. The Schrödinger's cat may have caught attention to some people, but it was essentially of nothing compared to the subsequent work, which was done in the third part of the paper, at the end of the third part of the paper, which was introduced this notion of entanglement. That's what is really important in modern physics. Now, Schrödinger's cat, as a sort of thing which is attached to Schrödinger's name, didn't catch on really until Schrödinger's paper, 1935 paper, was translated into English. And that didn't happen until as late as 1980, when it was translated by John Trimmer, and that when that appeared, then it was also began to be talked about by popular expositions of quantum mechanics. In Search of Schrödinger's Cat may have well been the first, by John Gribben. That's how we got into the state where there are so many jokes about Schrödinger's cat, I can't count them, and I would be quite happy if I never saw another joke about another cartoon about Schrödinger's cat. If I, as long as I live. It's become a tedious matter. But okay. So on the serious issue, there's the issue of entanglement. Now that became really spelled out by Schrödinger in a 1936 paper, which again was published in a rather obscure place in the Proceedings of the Cambridge Mathematical Society, but it was published in English, but it seems to have had no effect whatsoever. However, Schrödinger sent a copy of that to Einstein, and Einstein sent that to von Neumann. Now, why did he do that? Because Einstein read that paper and realized that the whole discussion was essentially stolen from von Neumann's 1932 book called The Mathematical Foundations of Quantum Mechanics, which was also in German, at that time not translated. So here's what Einstein said, or here's what von Neumann said, having now writing to Schrödinger, having been passed Schrödinger's letter and the article from Einstein. It seems plain what's intended in this exchange. It's very civilized, but you can read the subtext. Einstein has kindly shown me your letter, as well as a copy of the Proceedings of the Cambridge Philosophical Society manuscript. Sorry, that's the name of the journal. I feel rather more over-quoted than underquoted, and I feel that my merits in the subject are overemphasized. I am very glad, however, that you like the mixing method. Now, two things are very evident. One is the absolutely characteristic, gentlemanly quality of von Neumann's reply, to have underplayed his role in writing the 1932 book, which was completely seminal, it was a monumental effort, and it had a huge impact. There was a chapter in it on coupled systems, and that chapter was what Schrödinger had based his whole discussion on, without really any acknowledgement that that discussion was really based on von Neumann's book. It was pretending that it was, as it were, from nothing, from nowhere, straight out of Zeus's head, as one might say. And yet it wasn't. And I think it's still not, in fact, widely understood that, in fact, Schrödinger's paper was just simply taken from von Neumann. That's now the third incident. There was a fourth incident, and this is when things really seem to have blown up. In 1950s, after the Second World War, Schrödinger was working on unified field theory. Now, this was something that Einstein had been working on from the 1930s. It was his pet project, but he had not succeeded. Schrödinger decided that he was going to have a go himself. And that was disastrous, it seems, because when he wrote about these matters to Einstein, Einstein was very unhappy. He again thought that his work was being taken without acknowledgement, and that Schrödinger was claiming it for his own. Now, from what I can gather, at this point, Einstein threatened to go to a lawyer, or take this to the law and to sue. Schrödinger, in his turn, threatened to sue Einstein. Not sure why, or how, but there was this threat as well. And ironically, the whole thing had to be mediated and calmed down by the intermediary effect of all people, Wolfgang Pauli. The idea, if you know Wolfgang Pauli, of him having an intermediary quieting effect on anything is almost laughable, but that's apparently what happened. So at this point, things went from, as it were, from mildly bad to very bad. And this is what one finds in this process of plagiarism, even of this small whiff of plagiarism as it starts out. But as it goes on, it builds up a momentum in the person's mind and causes them to become very resentful, and it causes problems. And indeed, there were problems. And Schrödinger really was settled in a place where he was almost devoid of any surrounding contact with fellow physicists, and was working largely by himself, able to read what others were saying, able to correspond with people, but largely cut off from real contact, except for Paul Dirac, who was known as Pam to everyone. Pam. It's called Pam because his initials were PAM, so everyone called him Pam. It was the only contact that he really had. So this rot was infesting physics from 1926 onwards, and it ran all the way through, and it led to, not just in this case, but in other cases as well, of people feeling that they were taking credit for work that wasn't really theirs, and that they were reproducing this. And this underlying sense of resentment really caused an enormous problems with people able to collaborate together, and by the 1950s had led to a very large fracturing of the situation. Indeed, it was really one of the worst things that people didn't read Schrödinger's 1935 and 1936 work, where the idea of entanglement was put forward in a clear way. Because I must say, that term was invented by Schrödinger. It was not invented by von Neumann. Just as Schrödinger added the cat to the dynamite paradox, so Schrödinger added entanglement, the word entanglement, to the whole von Neumann discussion. And maybe that's an important thing to add in favor of Schrödinger. So this was a severe problem, because it was not really until the 1980s and 1990s that the whole issue of entanglement really came to the fore, and Schrödinger's papers had begun to be rediscovered. And they were rediscovered really by philosophers, not so much by physicists. Initially, it was a leaking out of philosophers talking about these things to eventually reaching physicists talking about these things. And many physicists resisted this matter for a long time. They're no longer doing so, but they were. How far back does this whole issue of plagiarism go? It goes back a long, long way. The first instance was really the first published philosopher, and that was Plato. Plato had had long philosophical discussions with the demagogue of Sicily, or Syracuse, whose name was Dionysius II. Those discussions, long after they had been given, Dionysius II decided to turn into a book of philosophy, which was not going to explain these matters as though they had been given by Plato to him, but his own wisdom was going to be recorded there, borrowing, uncredited, all of the work that Plato had done and had said to him. So all that way back, far back as that, you get this plagiarism stealing into academia. It goes back a long, long way and goes all the way through. Now, of course, we're in an epidemic. And once you have this epidemic in the proportions that it now exists, it's impossible, as I said in the first lecture, in the first part of this video series, that I can't see that it can be remedied and I can't see it can survive. The only way it would survive is if all the rot were somehow managed to be gotten rid of, as if you restart the universities, but this time with an idea of going back to doing it right. If that were to happen, then maybe, but no one is going to do that. No one. It's what needs to happen, and if it doesn't happen, then it will go on and things will get worse and worse. Students will continue to be robbed blind, which is what's happening, by bad teachers teaching nonsense, robbing them of money in order to, in a sense, in a modern word, to gaslight them into believing that they've had an education, because that's what it is. I said it before, it's like being in a cult. Well, it is. And that is gaslighting on a large scale. That cult is gaslighting a whole generation of students now, and the students do not know how to wake up from the broken mindset that they have been bequeathed. That is the situation that we find ourselves in. I'm sorry to be so bleak and the bearer of such bad news, but the situation really is this bad. Thanks for listening.